Welcome back to another episode of Why Do I Do That? Today's question is, why am I so afraid of dying? And people who think about dying all the time and they're really afraid of it, and they're thinking of all of these different scenarios. It's a form of anxiety. I would go as far as to call it death anxiety. It's very much tied in with health anxiety. There are a lot of people who, they have like a sore neck and they think they've got meningitis, or they've got a sore leg and they think they have cancer in their leg, and they catastrophize these small health niggles. There is an episode on this called Why Do I Think Any Small Health Niggle is a Life-Threatening Illness? And I dive a little bit deeper into specifically what health anxiety is. So you can check out that episode. That's a past one. But if we just focus in on dying today, I know a lot of clients that I have and myself as well, when my anxiety, like generalized anxiety, was at its highest, I was so aware of dying. I was so consumed by the thought of dying. It was on my mind all of the time. And it is just one of those generalized forms of anxiety. Once you start to feel unsafe and anxious, death is like the end. Death is the worst thing that could happen, right? If you follow any fear down to the bottom, it's often, for people, it's being alone and being isolated, which feels like death, or it's death itself. And so it's kind of that like bottom fear. And I think that we're wired for survival. We're wired for reproduction, for wanting to, have the next generations carry on and things like that. Like, we're biologically wired for survival and to want survival. Our brain's entire purpose is not to make us happy, but to survive. Our brain is there to tell us this is safe, this is not safe, this is acceptable, this is not acceptable. But everything that it's doing because it's keeping you alive and it's helping you to survive. So there is this like biological thing that's happening where we don't want to die because that's normal and natural. But when you're starting to think about it excessively, keyword excessively, and you're really afraid of dying and you're thinking about it all the time, I would be looking at your beliefs around death, because any client who has this excessive fear of dying have some really intense beliefs around what death is like. For instance, I have a lot of clients who have the belief that death is painful, that death is scary, that death is the end. So we also, if we get a little bit spiritual, we want to look at like, well, what's your beliefs around what happens after you die? If you believe that this is just the end, it's black, there's nothing, there can be fear in that, because it's literally the end. Whereas if you believe that there's something else after, death is not the end, death is just the end of this chapter, and there's something that comes after. So what you believe about death will have a really big impact on how anxious you are about it. If we think about anxiety, the belief that fuels anxiety is the belief of I am not safe. So a lot of the time what I ask my clients is like, what's not safe about dying? And it sounds like a silly question, because it's like, well, I'll be dead. But what people's responses are normally is like, well, it's not safe for me to die, or it's the worst thing that could happen if I died is that my children will have no one to look after them, and then they'll grow up with trauma, and then they'll end up killing themselves, because they'll have like, people's minds are wild where they go. But it's actually often not actually to do with the act or the actual dying. It's to do with what will happen, or time. It's to do with what are you going to miss out on. We have this fear of losing time. And this shows up with people who have this fear of death in their everyday life, in this rushing. There's a book by Dr. Libby Weaver called Rushing Woman Syndrome. And it shows up as this like, I need to make the most out of everything, and not in a way that you're like savoring life, but in a way that you're rushing because you think you're running out of time. And a lot of the time this fear of death is tied in with time. I'm running out of time. There's not enough time. And that is, again, a form of anxiety. It's like it's not safe to relax. It's not safe to let go. It's not safe to enjoy things because I'm running out of time. So these are all the sorts of beliefs that you would look at removing from your subconscious and replacing with things like there is enough time and it's safe to enjoy life, but also then looking at those beliefs around death and dying. And this is going to be shaped by a number of different things. So a lot of people, it can be losing someone early on in life. If it's in a really traumatic way, they have this perception of death, that it's traumatic and shocking and jarring. We could have people that have had parents or family members who have sickness for a really long period of time, and their beliefs around death is that it's painful and that it's drawn out, and that their view of death is actually more about sickness than it is about death. So we can have these different examples. It also depends on how your family or people in your life talk about death, what they believe about death, how they have responded when people have passed away. So quite common reaction, especially for people that go into shock, is that when somebody dies, they don't really talk to the children about it because they're so uncomfortable about death and dying. And what happens is then that child grows up thinking that death is this forbidden thing that we just don't talk about, we don't think about, we push it down, we shut it down. And as with emotions, as with anything, the more that we're afraid of something that we push it down, the stronger it pushes back up. And so if you're not allowed to talk about death, or you had someone pass away and no one ever spoke about them again or talked about it, as a child, you can also come up with these conclusions that death is the worst thing. It's scary, it's unspeakable, you don't talk about it. Those sorts of beliefs then, as I said, make it bigger and fuel this fear. So we have to become comfortable with death. And how can we become comfortable with death? It's such a interesting subject because we don't want to become so comfortable with death that we welcome it, obviously. We want to be so comfortable with death that we embrace life and we feel like we're fully in it and enjoying it and present in it, so that we know that if that does happen, we've lived to the best of our ability. And often this is not what happens, because some people who excessively fear death live so anxiously that they end up wasting their life, which is the fear that they have in the first place. It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. And I actually, last night, I was at my partner's family's house for dinner, and they were talking about the news, and they were talking about some things. I don't personally watch the news or listen to the radio. And if there's anything on social media I don't actually consume a lot on social media either. I put my things out, little bit of engagement, and then kind of get off. So I don't really know what's going on in the world a lot of the time. And they were talking to me about the potential of World War III, and some people were saying that it's very likely that World War III is coming, and that, what that would look like, and just all of the fears around that. And I thought about it for a moment, and then I said to my partner, I feel like if we got bombed and I died today, I would be happy, because I know that for the last however long I've been loving every single day, and I've been making the most of every single day. Like, I wouldn't die with any regrets. And that has not always been the case. There were times where if I thought about dying, I would be thinking, but I didn't get to do this and I didn't get to do that, and I wasn't who I wanted to be, and there was so much work that I still needed to do. So that in itself is something that you can sort of dig into. Like, what is it that you feel you need to do before you die, and why do you feel like you need to do that, and what would you be missing out on, and what would your regrets be, and all of that. I would start to use your fear of death as information about what's the narrative that comes up, what's the thoughts that come up, and what does that information say about how you're currently living your life. Because death is a part of life and we do have to accept it. But what we can't change when we're going to die. We can't change how we're going to die, which for some people, that's the anxiety, right? Because it's completely out of your control. We try so hard when we have anxiety to be in control because it makes us feel safe. Death is the ultimate it's the ultimate like fucking thing that you cannot control, which is why people with high anxiety get hyperfixated on it, because they try and figure out how they can control it, how they can stop it from happening. And they start getting, this is where people get OCD and things like that. They start getting these habits where they're trying to like safeguard themselves from not dying in that situation. And once we surrender to the fact that we actually do not have control over it at all we have control over is how we live our life every single day. And I can almost guarantee that if you started doing the healing work and got to the point where you were so happy with how you were showing up every day and who you were showing up as, and you were literally making the most and squeezing the juice out of every single day, that fear of death would be so much lower. And if I bring it back again to these beliefs that you have around death, there are some really good documentaries out there. So Ram Dass does, I think he has 3 documentaries. One of them is like all about dying and the other 2 kind of touch on it. He actually documents his journey into death. When he was quite old and he knew that he was going to pass, he documented it, and it's actually really beautiful to watch. And that sounds strange to watch a documentary about someone dying, and for it to be beautiful, but I highly recommend. I think it's called Dying to Know. And his idea is he's interviewed and talked to a lot of different people about death and about what it feels like. So he's interviewed people who've had experiences where they've died and come back to life. And I actually had a similar thing where I went through a period where I was trying to work around my death beliefs, and I had read a lot of different books from people who had died and been resuscitated or who had come back to life. And what was so wild to me is that all of them explained the same thing. They all explained this, like what it felt like, the layers that they went through, like it was uncanny. Like they all explained the same experience, which made me think there fucking has to be something happening after death if they're all coming back and they're saying that the same thing happened. And what it sounded like to me was that they were going up through these like different layers of consciousness. And he talks about death in the same way, like his perception of it. He talks about it in the same way that they describe it, which is taking off a really tight shoe at the end of the day. So like imagine that you're wearing a really tight shoe. It's like a size too small, and your toes are killing and your like foot is swelling and it's squished in this tight shoe. And at the end of the day, you take it off and your foot is just like, oh. Now, that is his definition of death that he had come to through interviewing all of these people, is that our souls and our consciousness, so we have our thoughts, and then we have the part that can see our thoughts, right? You have the part of you that thinks, and you have the part of you that witnesses your thoughts and thinks, why am I thinking about that? So that's your consciousness, the part that witnesses your human self here and can look down and go, I'm Jess sitting here on this chair. That's your consciousness. And so this consciousness, he explains, is like, it's huge, it's expansive, and it's trying to fit into this little body, and it feels uncomfortable. And he talks about like how many humans feel uncomfortable in their humanness, and when they die, their soul just expands, and it's this feeling of like taking off a really tight shoe. And you know what? It could 100% not be true. Like, what is truth? But for me, when I heard it, I was like, that's what I want to believe. That's what I want to believe. And I worked with my subconscious of like, that's what it is. When I die, my soul is just going to expand and I'm going to be part of all that is. And everyone described it as this feeling of complete love and acceptance for everything, everyone, just this overwhelming feeling of love. Some of them explained like loved ones that had passed coming in and saying beautiful things to them, all different experiences, but the exact same feeling of expansiveness. And so when I think about that, that actually doesn't sound too bad. And so once I started to reprogram my subconscious to believe that, there was this lightness and this feeling of like, when that happens, that's going to be great. And I'm going to be okay with that because that's a good outcome for me. If before that, when I used to think that you would die and it was just black, like when I was younger, I used to have this perception of you die and it's just it. You're in the ground, it's black, there's nothing. That was a really scary thought to me. And once I started to learn about consciousness, and I learned that like scientifically consciousness is energy, and energy cannot be destroyed. It can only be like repurposed into a different structure. I was like, oh, okay, so you actually, the part of you that is witnessing you can't actually be destroyed. Therefore, you'll always be somewhere. I found that really comforting, and hopefully you find that comforting too. And that's some of the sort of subconscious beliefs that you can start to reprogram so that death doesn't become so scary. And then I think now the only time that I ever fear death and think about it is in relation to my children, which I touched on before. And I think that's a very real fear, is like leaving your children, not getting to see your children grow up, things like that. And again, if I ever do have thoughts like that, I just witness them as fearful thoughts and think about that's actually something that I can't control. And I remind myself, again, if you follow it down, control equals you're trying to feel safety. And so I remind myself, I'm safe. My kids are safe. It's safe to just let that thought go. And I bring myself back into a feeling of safety. So if you're one of those people that is like imagining gruesome deaths and you're afraid of death and you're thinking about your kids dying, you have a lot of work to do first before you even look into your death and time beliefs and where you're not living authentically and what you would regret if you died and all of those sorts of questions. I would highly implore you to get a journal and start writing down the answers to those. But I'd first be working on safety. How can you feel more safe in your everyday life? How can you feel more safe in your body? How can you feel more safe financially, romantically? Like safety, safety, safety. Where don't you feel safe? And what do you need to do in order to feel safe? And for some people with generalized anxiety, that's literally just a belief linked to a memory. So one of the common misconceptions is that anxiety is just genetic or that people just have anxiety for no reason. It's just not true. Like you just don't have anxiety for no reason. The only exception to this rule is that a woman when pregnant is developing the window of tolerance in the nervous system of her child. If your mum was pregnant with you and she was highly anxious, you could be born with a very small window of tolerance, which is your ability to handle the stresses of everyday life. And your nervous system would be dysregulated from birth, which means you would then come out as a crying baby, screaming all the time, not able to regulate. If your mum was anxious in pregnancy, she's probably fucking anxious now when you're screaming all the time. Therefore, she gets more anxious, you get more anxious, she gets more frustrated and flustered, and you literally grow up as a child with anxiety. That is literally the only scenario where you can be born with anxiety. But most of the time, it's coming from, if you have healthy, regulated parents who don't have anxiety, there's a moment where something that happened that made you feel extremely unsafe that is unprocessed. And what it takes is just processing that memory or those memories, however many there might be, to let that part of you know or to go back into that memory and close it off. A traumatic memory is a memory that's open, and we want to close it so that you can know that that was then and this is now. Because until we process them, our brain doesn't know that they're not current when they're activated. So we need to go off and close off all those memories and where we felt unsafe, and we need to bring in this feeling of safety. And then we need to replace these beliefs of I'm not safe, it's not safe too. Because once we have the belief of I'm not safe, we start to collect and stack these sub-beliefs on top of it of like, it's not safe to go outside, it's not safe to walk down the street, it's not safe to drive when it's raining, it's not safe to drive over a bridge, it's not safe to go to the supermarket, it's not safe to whatever it is. As you have this belief of I'm not safe, you collect additional beliefs that support it. And they can be from you hear that someone got shot in a supermarket and so all of a sudden you have anxiety when you go to the supermarket, or whatever it is. It can be things you've heard or experienced. You start to stack and stack and stack until you have this whole host of beliefs that make everything feel unsafe. And once everything starts to feel unsafe, of course, the worst thing that could happen is that you die and you get this fear of death. So if I circle it all the way back, we need to work on safety, the beliefs, where you decided and where you first created that you're not safe, and then all of that other stuff around death and time and living in alignment. So I hope that helped for the person who asked this question. I'm sure you are not alone. Every episode that somebody asks a question, I have so many friends, family, followers that are binging the same episodes because they have the same questions as you. So I hope this helps everybody who has this fear of dying. And if you are afraid and you can't kick it, it's something I work with all the time. Book a one-on-one session. I can help you get to the bottom of it and shift that from your subconscious. Thanks again for listening, and remember to share.